Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us both online and in person to celebrate and to hear about the research of our 2024 Panmure House winner, Professor Kirk Doran. Welcome, Professor Doran. Before I talk about the genesis and impact of the prize, I should provide some background for those of you who haven't been to Panmure House before. Built in 1691, the name is derived from the Earls of Panmure. It was their town seat. But its most claim to fame was being the final residence of Adam Smith, who occupied the house from 1778 to his death in 1790. And across these 12 years, Smith actually completed his two masterworks, or completed final editions of his masterworks, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the first, and then, of course, The Wealth of Nations, which is familiar to us all. In 2008, Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University rescued the derelict building, and 10 years later, it was formally reopened as a centre for social debate and scholarship. Today, the idea is to bring here thought leaders, policy makers, key practitioners to effect positive change, forge global, future-focused networks as our society moves on. Panmure House Prize is an annual award of $75,000 made possible by Baillie Gifford and supported by our partner organisations here, FCLT Global. The award is intended to support and fund research which explores the relationship between long-term thinking and radical innovation. And it's awarded to emerging leaders in academia and to enable research that enables Adam Smith's own approach to rigorous empiricism and long-term interdisciplinary thinking. The prize opportunity is open to academics in and across all disciplines, and their entries are shortlisted and judged by our special Panmure House panel, including several of those who are joining us online today: David Pitt-Watson, Renosi Mukati, Adrian Orr, and Dame Heather McGregor, who is Provost and Vice Principal of Heriot-Watt University in Dubai. I'm also joined here by James Anderson, long-term supporter of the prize, Adam Dixon, who's chair of Panmure House Prize, Hiro Mizuno, and Olivier Leleu from FCLT Global, who help administer the prize. And the idea is that prize winners utilize the award to conduct their proposed research from their home institution, working to publish and publish their findings within peer-reviewed journals. If I'm to go to the substantive business that we're all here for this afternoon, which is to hear from Professor Doran, the business of this afternoon is about innovation, because the prize, the Adam Smith Prize, and the lecture we're going to hear is about the nature of innovation. And Professor Doran's particular contribution is relates to the role of networks in creating innovation. And that, I think, should be in contrast to the idea that innovation is about great men, that we're waiting for the man of genius to come and reset the world we have known. The Carlyle, as it were, translated into economics. Nor is economic growth about more stuff. It's not about diverting ever larger sums into so-called public investment. Economic growth and innovation are about people, and they're all about people working together. And economic growth is achieved by the accumulation of ideas, of knowledge, and of capabilities in organizations and in firms. And Professor Doran's research also touches on the role of prizes in promoting this, which seems very appropriate for the moment, not only because we're here to award him a prize, but because on very related themes, we awarded the prize last year to Joe Henry. And of course, you are all aware that the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded in the last month, particularly to Joel Mokyr, whose contribution to thinking about innovation relates very much to the themes we want to talk about today. And it's very appropriate that we should be talking about all of this here in this room, because we know that Smith is most famous, and he introduces the Wealth of Nations by talking about the division of labor, and that relates directly to the way in which the division of labor works together, as he describes, to produce output. This is also the place where much of the manifestation of the network effects we're talking about was realized, that the Scottish Enlightenment was an accumulation of a network of people in Edinburgh in the 18th century, which changed the world. And Adams Ferguson was certainly here with Smith. I looked to see David Hume could never quite have made it, because David Hume died just before Adam Smith bought this particular property. But Smith and Hume certainly did know each other and work together. And of course, Adam Ferguson was another person who we found here. The purpose of Panmure House is to create new networks of people, to revisit that kind of enlightenment in the hope that we can do something similar again in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and perhaps centred here. So let me not talk for much longer, except to say, introduce Professor Doran. He's Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Notre Dame. I was warned when I came here that university is pronounced somewhat differently in America to what it is in France. But I spend a proportion of time in France. And even if I didn't do that, I have in mind the idea that Miss Phillip, the ghost of Miss Phillip, who taught me French in a school just 100 meters up the hill from here, the ghost of Miss Phillip would be looking at me as I talk about Notre Dame. So Notre Dame it is. But Doran received his BA in physics from Harvard, another degree in Harvard, and a PhD from Princeton. And his dissertation won a Princeton's Labor Economics Dissertation Award. His research still focuses on labor economics, but also innovation, economics, and international migration, and human capital complementarities, the networks I've been describing. And his work has examined the implications of large migrations of top scientists, particularly from Russia, as we all know, on the productivity, on knowledge generation of their peers. Research work has focused on externalities, collaboration, and geographic distance. And of course, I've already mentioned the impact of prizes. Research has been published in a whole variety of major journals, but I think we don't just judge any more research in terms of the list of journals in which it's published. We want to talk about the impact of research, and that's what I hope we'll talk about now. So let me invite Professor Kirk Professor Doran to the stage, and he will present his research before joining me for a Q&A. So please submit if you're online, please submit your questions on the live stream in the comments box, or of course, if you're here in the room, you can ask them directly when we've finished. But let me invite Professor Doran to join me on the stage.
So thank you, Sir John, and thank you to everyone here. I'm delighted and honored to be here. So today, I will propose a hypothesis about radical innovation and long-term economic growth. The last several decades have seen an explosion in research on economic growth and its mechanisms. Indeed, the growth rate of research on economic growth has been quite robust. Unfortunately, the growth rate of the actual economy has not been. From the outset, we must remember what Adam Smith taught us. Economic growth is synonymous with growth in productivity. Although our best measurements of productivity are still imperfect, they consistently show an important story. Total factor productivity growth rates increased from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century in America and the world, and then declined considerably in the following decades. Our question is, why did this happen? Why did productivity growth rates increase for so many decades, reach a peak in the mid-20th century, and then decline so much since then? And what can we do about it? There are no doubt many causal pathways at work, but it is helpful to focus our questioning by considering what causal pathways have been identified in common by the diverse disciplines which have addressed this question. Too often we stay siloed in our own discipline, not looking for connections and complementarities with other work. But it is exactly in these connections and complementarities between disciplines that the answers to difficult questions may lie. The areas of research which have addressed economic growth and its mechanisms over the last several decades are quite diverse. They include theoretical economic models, economic history, economic anthropology and sociology, the psychology and neuroscience of creativity, and my own area of research, causal empirical analysis with quasi-random variation. Ex ante, it is very unlikely that such diverse disciplines, all independently pursuing their own lines of research, would have identified the same likely culprit behind our decline in growth. That makes it all the more startling that, I believe, they have. Taking what is common across these disciplines, we can surmise the following. The reason we are growing more slowly than we used to is because we are simply less good at coming up with and sharing good ideas than we used to be. Today I will share the evidence for why I believe this is the case, and I will propose a hypothesis of my own. The reason we are less good at coming up with and sharing good ideas than we used to be has something to do with how we now relate to each other more generally. Starting at the most theoretical level, we can ask, what do current theoretical models of economic growth suggest might cause a multi-decade slowdown in growth rates? Our current theoretical models build on the insight of the 2018 economics Nobel laureate Paul Romer, that it is impossible for the economy to increase its growth without new knowledge, and that at the heart of knowledge's impact on the economy is its non-rivalness. Knowledge is non-rival, and that many people can use it at the same time without there being any less of it. When this non-rivalness is actualized, when the new knowledge is diffused so that many people are explicitly and implicitly using it at once, like all of my children using the Pythagorean theorem for their homework at the same time without having to take turns, then the new knowledge can bring about increasing returns to scale and productivity growth. These modern models would point to a decline in the creation and diffusion of new knowledge as a likely, if not necessary, culprit behind any long-term decline in TFP growth rates of the nations at the frontier of technology. Of course, these models permit other sources of such a slowdown in growth, but the other sources would reveal themselves through visible things which are easy to observe, such as declines in capital accumulation, which is doing fine, or declines in population, which, despite our falling fertility, have not yet actually happened and could not easily be responsible for a growth slowdown since the 1960s. If we are consistently growing more slowly, then our current theoretical framework at the frontier of economic modeling would tend to tell us that this slowdown implies that we are producing and sharing less useful knowledge than we used to. This conclusion is very consonant with the best recent work in economic history. In his exhaustive exploration of the historical record, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, Robert Gordon concludes that TFP growth rates decreased from their mid-20th century peak because the usefulness of our new ideas decreased as well. The usefulness of our best ideas in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s was simply greater than the usefulness of our best ideas in the decades since then. Indeed, everything from jet engines to moon landings, from modern refrigeration to microwave ovens, from transistors to the integrated circuit, from computers to the internet was invented during this era. Better search engines and the iPhone pale in comparison, perhaps mere applications built on the revolutionary foundations laid by our grandparents. Now, before we go any further, we might question how this budding explanation could possibly be true. After all, today we are devoting more labor and effort to scientific and engineering research than ever before, in absolute and in per capita terms. If it were really the case that we are creating, sharing, and receiving less useful knowledge today than in past generations, it would have to mean that our scientific and engineering workforce has declined substantially in useful output per person, a decline that has happened in spite of growing substantially in the number of scientists working, in spite of ever-expanding years and intensity of scientific training, and in spite of substantial increases in research funding and contractual research expectations, in team size and complementary resources for knowledge sharing, such as the internet. A grim thought indeed. But sure enough, our best estimates show that useful scientific output per person has decreased substantially over time. One way of measuring this is to consider progress on specific long-standing questions, such as how to increase the number of transistors on a microchip. Moore's law says that we tend to find some way to double the number of transistors per microchip every 2 years. Research by Nicholas Bloom, Charles Jones, and others has shown that this doubling has required exponential growth in the number of engineers involved in figuring out the new knowledge of how to do this. Useful knowledge output per engineer has decreased substantially over time. We've kept up with Moore's law by pouring more and more engineers into keeping it going. And eventually we will, through sheer arithmetic, run out of engineers. Indeed, in every area capable of such minute observation, our success in attaining new knowledge about these well-defined problems is slower and slower every year. It requires exponentially more scientists and engineers to maintain the same constant growth rates in the usefulness of our new knowledge in these areas. One might object that this is a measurement of how good we are at making progress on existing questions. What about how good we are at asking new questions? It turns out that we have also gotten less good at asking new questions which change whole fields of inquiry. We do that less frequently than we used to. A 2023 publication in the journal Nature examined 45 million scientific papers and 3.9 million patents and found that bibliometric tells, which reveal a revolutionary new direction in a field of research, are now less likely to happen than they were in the past. Indeed, even if one casts a skeptical eye at bibliometric measurements, an authority no less august than the Nobel Prize Committee has implicitly concurred. Nobel Prizes for work in recent decades have plummeted in favor of continuing to award work completed in the ever more distant 1970s and 1980s. We have become less and less good at making progress on existing questions, and we've become less and less good at proposing fruitful new ones. Again, one might object that this evidence is just about creating new knowledge. If we are getting better at sharing existing knowledge over time, then given the large stock of existing knowledge and how much of it has not yet been fruitfully shared, such improvements in sharing could, at least temporarily, offset declines in knowledge discovery. And isn't the internet and the communications revolution all about getting better at sharing new knowledge? Once again, the real story is more grim. The estimates by Ufuk Akajit of the University of Chicago and others show that a well-known long-run decline in business dynamism since the 1980s has, as its most likely culprit, a substantial decline in knowledge diffusion across firms. Today, in spite of the internet, the most important knowledge increasingly stays siloed in a handful of entities, and every year it becomes less and less likely to be usefully shared with others in a way that can impact economic activity. To review before we go further, economic models, economic history, and economic and bibliometric data all point to declines in how good we are at producing new knowledge and how good we are at sharing that new knowledge as likely culprits for our decline in productivity growth rates. We are less good at making progress on existing scientific questions than we used to be. We are less good at asking new fruitful questions, and we're less good at sharing and receiving the results of these inquiries. Now we may ask, why might this be the case? Amid all the possible explanations for such a decrease in creativity and knowledge diffusion, where would we even begin our search for an explanation? It would be easiest if there were something inherent to human psychology and even brain physiology that was true for all human beings and which connected creativity to observable things in our environment, observable things which can change and which have changed over the last several decades. Overall health, nutrition, and lifespans have continued to increase, and most forms of physical pollution have decreased. So no well-known material causes like these are likely to be at fault. What can the psychology and neuroscience of human creativity tell us, if anything? Here we can draw on the work of the eminent neurologist Ian McGilchrist, fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. McGilchrist has shown that the most obvious physiological distinction within the human brain, the right brain, left brain distinction, is actually very relevant for creativity. In particular, much of what we associate with creativity, including breadth of vision, the capacity to forge distant links, flexibility, a willingness to respond to changing context, and analogical thinking, are all better served by the right hemisphere than the left. He finds that there seems to be a marked increase in reliance on the right hemisphere among the highly creative. And here's the key. He also finds that right hemisphere thinking is associated with emotional intelligence and nourished by in-person human interactions. He finds that the right hemisphere is superior at emotional expression and receptivity. It is crucial for empathy and for a sense of agency. It is of critical importance for social and emotional understanding. And crucially, McGilchrist finds that changing social context can change the relative level of right brain expression. Creativity and sociality are thus associated within our very brains, and neuroplasticity suggests that both individuals and perhaps societies can develop or inhibit these traits. This raises the obvious further question: did the rise of human creativity and economic growth coincide with any changes to human psychology and human relationships? The answer should be no surprise to this audience. Yes. The work of our previous Adam Smith Panmure House Prize winner, Joseph Henrich, a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, by the way, conclusively shows that our most important past increases in economic growth occurred in part because of changes to human psychology that were pro-social in nature and were nourished by, and in turn nourished, changes in human society that emphasized deeper trust and interaction with an ever broader group of people. These changes culminated in an increase in creative output, which eventually led to the scientific and industrial revolutions and the unprecedented economic growth which followed. The research of Henrich and his co-authors makes clear that the story of the rise of innovation and economic growth is tied to the rise of trust and deep interactions among human beings, and to the changes in pro-social psychology which supported this. Likewise, the work of 2025 Economics Nobel laureate Joel Mokyr, in his book, The Gifts of Athena, emphasizes that economic history points to deep interpersonal connections as the deciding factor behind why an industrial enlightenment emerged in Britain in the late 18th century. He writes that the crucial elements were neither brilliant individuals nor the impersonal forces governing the masses, but a small group of a few thousand people who formed a creative community based on the exchange of knowledge. Many of those individuals were right here in Edinburgh, by the way. The personal and informal contacts so central to the operation of these creative communities took place in the scientific societies, academies, coffee house lectures, and other meetings. The changes in the social environment in which useful knowledge was created and disseminated led not only to an increase in discovery, but also to higher diffusion. To review, the reason economic growth has declined in recent decades is that we are less good at creating and sharing useful new knowledge than we used to be. A hint about why this might be the case comes from the most obvious physiological distinction in the human brain, the hemispheres. Creativity is most closely associated with the right hemisphere, and this hemisphere also has a close connection with emotional intelligence, personal relationships, and social understanding. Further hinting at a possible link between creativity and human relationships, we have the work of Henrich, which shows that such a link was at the heart of the rise of modern economies during the centuries from the dawn of civilization through the Industrial Revolution, and the work of Joel Mokyr, which shows that such a link was the deciding factor in the Industrial Enlightenment of the United Kingdom. Finally, theoretical models of economic growth built around the non-rivalness of knowledge all are predicated on the existence of networks of interactions and relationships among human beings through which knowledge can be shared, received, and diffused effectively, making human relationships at the heart of the actualization of non-rivalness necessary for economic growth. The question remains, are mechanisms connecting deep in-person interactions with creativity and knowledge diffusion at work in the economy today? Even if there is the potential for such a connection in human brain physiology, even if such a connection was important in the founding of the modern economy in the past, even if our main theoretical models presume sufficient human interactions as a necessity for growth, none of that would necessarily and conclusively imply that such a connection is still relevant today, and that it is thus potentially related to our current multi-decade decline in creative usefulness and economic growth. To see if this connection is still relevant, I turn to the 10 papers which I have contributed to the question of how people generate and share new knowledge, as well as the associated literature around them. These papers are part of the subdiscipline of empirical research, which uses quasi-random variation to tease out economic mechanisms. Two otherwise similar people, firms, departments, or fields of research are compared over time, with one of them, for random or quasi-random reasons, experiencing a shock which the other does not. Continuing to compare these entities before and after the shock can help tell us the causal effect of this shock on other outcomes. The problem is, how do you shock either of the variables we are trying to relate? How do you shock the quality of human relationships and see the subsequent effects on creativity, or vice versa? Not only are the relevant variables hard to change with controlled variation, they're hard to measure or even observe. Knowledge is not physical, and it's invisible, as is its diffusion. The quality of a deep collaboration is not visible externally, except to those who may be lucky enough to know the partners personally. Fortunately, it is possible to discern evidence of a change in immaterial things from a change in material ones, and of a change in invisible things from a change in visible ones. The thing to do is to start with an organizing principle, a conceptual framework to help us connect seemingly disparate and sometimes invisible things together. The conceptual framework I will build is inspired by the work of 2018 Nobel laureate Paul Romer and his frequent co-author Charles Jones. Jones and Romer propose a simple model of how economies produce things, which includes two effects which are in direct opposition to each other. The first effect is one that causes the effort we put into producing things to result in diminishing returns. This is a common feature of human efforts more generally. Eventually, our ever-increasing inputs peter out, and doing more adds nothing to our output. The second effect, in opposition to our first one, is the effect of non-rival knowledge, or indeed any non-rival input whatsoever. As long as there is a non-rival input to production, we have a chance to more than double our output when we double all of our inputs. This means we have a chance to escape decreasing returns to scale and obtain per capita economic growth. We can think of this as a race between decreasing and increasing returns to scale. If increasing returns to scale win, then we have an increase in output per person. If decreasing returns to scale win, growth eventually stops. The way increasing returns to scale can win in such models, and the only way they can win, is if there are non-rival inputs to production which can be and which are shared widely. What my co-author George Borjas and I did was to propose that this simple model of production in general can also apply to the production of knowledge itself. If we conceptualize the production of knowledge as a race between decreasing and increasing returns, we can use observable evidence of which side wins that race to discern something about things that are hard to observe. Specifically, the visible thing we focus on is displacement effects in the context of migration. Taken at their most general, displacement effects are typical economic phenomena characteristic of all markets. Whenever anything is exchanged in markets, demand or supply curves exist, and these demand and supply curves have slopes, and these slopes affect prices and quantities. When equilibrium changes in response to a shock, the new balance in each of the relevant markets typically implies that some inputs to production have to change in order to support this new equilibrium. Labor is one of the most important of these inputs to production, and it is difficult for new equilibria to emerge without labor inputs changing their allocations across firms, geographic locations, industries, fields of research, and the overall labor force. But in fact, in the specific context of migration and innovation, displacement effects are of special importance, precisely because of what they reveal. In particular, in the context of innovation, strong displacement effects reveal that something very important did not happen. Let me explain in detail and then make a hypothesis. Through the conceptual framework we just discussed, it is easy to see that there are two opposing forces that determine the sign of what happens to the marginal product of innovators who experience a shock to the innovative labor force through migration. First, there's the effect of diminishing marginal product, arising from labor becoming congested like all rival inputs to production on any fixed inputs. On the other hand, there is the effect of non-rival knowledge, in which the increase in the stock of knowledge brought about by migration causes the productivity of innovators to increase. The possibility of productivity increases from migration of innovators depends on the existence of these large knowledge spillovers and anything else that is necessary for such spillovers to occur. Once we know this, we can make a lot of progress, because much of what happens in the labor market in response to the migration of innovators depends on how the marginal product of an innovator is affected by migration. When their marginal product increases due to migration, innovators are likely to keep working as such, since their pay and their rewards are determined by their productivity. But when their marginal product decreases due to migration, some of them will instead be likely to depart their R&D labs and move to different jobs, since their pay and other rewards as innovators have now decreased. We can therefore propose the following hypothesis. When the non-rivalness of knowledge is actualized through useful knowledge being created and widely shared, displacement effects of innovators due to migration of other innovators are less likely. When the non-rivalness of knowledge is dormant, displacement effects of innovators due to migration of innovators are more likely. Likewise, by observing the direction and sign of displacement effects, we can therefore infer the size of these knowledge spillovers between migrants and others. This allows us to formulate and test the more specific hypothesis relevant for today's talk. If it is really the case that close collaboration and in-person human interaction is relevant for the creation and sharing of sufficient knowledge to bring about increasing returns and economic growth, then we should see large displacement effects whenever collaboration is not occurring during episodes of migration, and small or reverse displacement effects whenever collaboration is occurring. This is a hypothesis we can test again and again with multiple natural experiments in the modern economy, starting with evidence circa World War II and continuing from then to the present day. I and my co-authors and peers in this literature have assembled a large body of natural experiments regarding migration of innovators into and out of communities of other innovators. In each case, we can observe whether various forms of collaboration are occurring, as well as whether productivity of innovators is a positive or negative function of the arrival of other innovators. As just one example, consider my work in a series of papers with George Borjas on the arrival of former Soviet mathematicians into the West after the collapse of Soviet communism circa 1990. On each side of the border, we have a natural experiment which allows us to explore today's hypothesis. In the West, we can compare otherwise similar Western mathematicians, some of whom were working on topics the Soviets knew about, and others who were not. The first group of scientists received a flood of new colleagues and potential collaborators after 1990. The latter group did not. On the eastern side of the border, we have the reverse experiment. Some Russian mathematicians lost many colleagues and collaborators, while others, for quasi-random reasons, did not. Comparing these groups with each other over time, we can see that displacement effects and declines in productivity occurred precisely when collaboration did not happen, and increases in productivity occurred when collaboration did occur. Likewise, in my work on the main highly skilled immigration program to the United States, the H-1B visa program, I've found that US firms which randomly received new highly skilled immigrants experienced displacement of other workers if they were also the firms which experienced no increase in measured innovation from the new immigrants. Exploring the data further, we can see with ancillary evidence that the workers in these cases were used for basic coding and tech support rather than for the collaborative operations that would have resulted in innovation. These are not isolated examples. Remarkably, all of the natural experiments I've explored or reviewed in this literature show the same pattern. Whatever the experiment or setting, whether it is changes to highly skilled immigration policy in the United States, or emigration in response to the Nazis in Germany, whether it is loss of co-authors due to migration, or the loss of co-authors due to death, the pattern remains. Where there is close collaboration in movement of people increases productivity and decreases displacement. Where there is not close collaboration, migration brings about the opposite. Even randomized field experiments have shown the same effect. My co-author Ina Ganguly conducted an experiment in which some potential pairs of co-authors were randomly assigned to spend in-person time together at a conference, and other identical pairs were randomly assigned to a control group. Only those randomly assigned to spend physical in-person time together went on to create new knowledge and publications together. In this literature, we at last have evidence of a causal connection between in-person interaction and collaboration on one hand, and knowledge discovery and sharing on the other in the modern economy. To review, the main reason that economic growth has declined in nations at the frontier of technology is that we have not been pushing that frontier forward at the speed we have in the past. The usefulness of our best new creative ideas and our ability to share and receive these ideas among each other has declined considerably over the past several decades. Evidence from brain physiology, psychology, economic anthropology, and the history of the building of the modern economy all suggests that one important reason why people might become worse at deep creativity and knowledge sharing over time is that something has gone missing from human interactions and collaboration, which used to be more present. Evidence from natural experiments and quasi-random variation in the modern economy shows that a link between deep in-person interaction and collaboration on one hand, and knowledge discovery and sharing on the other, still exists in the modern economy today. It remains to show, has anything changed in in-person relationships, commitment to pro-sociality, deep companionship, collaboration, and interaction with others over the last several decades? We are all familiar with declines in these things during COVID, but what about the long-run trends over several decades? The best data in the world on in-person interactions, friendship, and companionship probably comes from the large time use surveys conducted in the United States monthly since 2003. The American Time Use Survey, like its long-term counterparts in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, uses time diaries to record how a nationally representative sample of individuals spend their 1,440 minutes of each day. Has anything changed about how we have spent our time in the last 25 years? What does our time use show about the kind of interactions we have with each other now, about the density of the network of these interactions, and how that network has grown thicker or sparser over time? Here I plot the number of minutes the average American spends each day on socializing and communicating with others, from 2003 through 2024. Several things are apparent. Women spend more time socializing and communicating than do men. The long-run trends for both sexes are negative, and COVID decreases are in many respects a mere continuation of an overall trend. In the last 22 years, there has been a 25% decline in the number of minutes spent each day socializing and communicating with one another in person. We can't use this data to know when this declining trend began because the trend begins as soon as the data does. But whenever it started, it has been rapid and consistent. Once this trend became apparent and better noticed, the United States Surgeon General issued a 2023 report on the details. Plotting 6 data series from 2003 until right before COVID began, we can see that the details show how broad-based this decline in social engagement and communication with others has been. Whether it is social engagement with family in your own household or social engagement with extended family outside of it. Whether it is shared leisure for the sake of enjoyment and intrinsic satisfaction or shared leisure in general. Whether it is social engagement with friends or social engagement with others who are usually neighbors, the trends are very negative and very stark. The one thing that has increased is the number of hours each month in which people are totally physically isolated from all other human beings. Keeping in mind that this is clearly a broad-based trend and that our high-quality time use data does not go back long enough to use time diaries to determine when the downward trend began, we can ask, what ancillary evidence could we use to determine when this downward trend likely began? Here we can draw on the work of sociologist Robert Putnam, who looked at different measures of social engagement which, while not measuring time spent with friends or neighbors per se, are potentially related to such time and foundational to it. For example, here are Putnam's figures for membership in the kind of social and neighborhood organizations which often foster friendship and other social interactions. As you can see, this measure of social engagement increased from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century, then began a long-run decline. Putnam also tracks many other types of social engagement that plausibly form the foundation of friendships and regular human interactions, including measures of trust, participation in democratic institutions, and participation in social traditions such as marriage. An overall trend towards individualism and declining social engagement took root in the mid-20th century and has continued since then. Thus, lacking consistent data on time spent with neighbors, friends, and others from before 2003, we can nevertheless see that it is plausible that the decline that we can see over the last 25 years, in fact, began much earlier. Putting all of this together, let's plot a version of Putnam's graph with our graph of total factor productivity growth rates. As we can see, productivity growth rates increased, peaked, and decreased during the same time period over the last 150 years that multiple measures of social interaction increased, peaked, and decreased as well. Recalling what we have already covered, we have good micro-evidence of a causal link in every individual setting that we have examined between in-person, deep, repeated interactions and collaborations on one hand, and successful creativity and knowledge diffusion on the other. We know that in-person interactions and collaborations have a causal effect on knowledge creation and diffusion in every individual experiment, natural and otherwise, that we have explored. It is therefore likely that any aggregate increases and decreases in social interaction that we have observed had some causal impact on the aggregate knowledge creation and diffusion, which we know to be responsible for economic growth. What does this mean in practical terms? It means missing collaborations, missing partnerships, and missing insights shared and received with others. Admirable attention has been paid by health authorities in the United States and the United Kingdom to the negative physical health effects that come from complete social isolation. But much less attention has been paid to the negative effects on innovation, ideas, and knowledge, which people everywhere experience when people everywhere decide to pull back from social engagement. The effects of such a pullback are invisible but powerful. They are all the missing partnerships, great ideas, and new businesses which should have happened but never did. These relationships are among the invisible, immaterial inputs to economic growth. They are difficult to measure or even observe when they exist, and of course we don't see them when they're not there at all. I want to close by addressing three follow-up questions. First, what caused this long-run increase in social engagement, and what caused the long-run decrease? Many authors, government agencies, and disciplines have attempted to address this question since the trends first became apparent. No individual explanation is perfect. But what I want to emphasize is that it is not likely that one simple change in extrinsic circumstances or incentives is behind all of this. The increase and decrease in social engagement is not trivially explained by changes in earnings opportunities, changes in public infrastructure, entertainment options, or other technology. Indeed, changes in all of these things reflect themselves more fundamental realities in the human heart and human culture, which themselves also directly determine our degree of engagement with each other. Second, is there any hope of the field of economics ever coming to terms with the conceptual importance of such things as the quality of interpersonal relationships, the time spent on them, and the tendency or lack thereof within each human person in a given culture to appreciate what is potentially good in itself about interacting with others? Economics usually defines the apprehension of what is good about something, or the habits of mind and body which help instantiate such goods, as something within the category of preferences. And the field of economics tries to create theories which are neutral about such preferences. If some people or cultures like to interact regularly with both friends and neighbors, that's fine. If others do not, that's fine too. Our job as economists has typically been to take preferences as a given and to create theories of growth which show how an economy can grow regardless of what preferences people have. In one sense, it would be a big ask for the field of economics to conclude that an entire culture with an increasing preference for being alone, an entire culture in which the good of getting to know other people better and explore opportunities together just for the sake of it is a good that is unknown to many people and increasingly so. It would be a big ask for the field of economics to say, well, those preferences are not going to lead to growth. You should consider changing your preferences. Nevertheless, there is some precedent for the field of economics recognizing that the key inputs to growth may have a non-physical and invisible nature, and that our attitudes and preferences may matter at least as much as the existence of rational incentives and the rule of law. For example, Adam Smith wrestled with the moral roots of a productive human society and introduced all of us to an invisible hand that depended on learning and human development as much as it depended on physical circumstances. In the present day, our leading branch of growth theory is, at its foundation, quite amenable to the existence of a variety of immaterial inputs to production, which may be essential for growth. I want to read the words of Paul Romer at the start of the current revolution in endogenous growth theory in detail, because they contain a hint of what is possible for the field of economics. As Romer explained in his own words in 1990, the most basic premise in our scientific reasoning about the physical world is that it is possible to replicate any sequence of events by replicating the relevant initial conditions. This is both a statement of faith and a definition of relevant initial conditions. For production theory, this means that it is possible to double the output of any production process by doubling all of the rival inputs. By definition, the non-rival inputs can be used again in the replica process. It's what the word non-rival means. Hence, if there are any non-rival inputs that have productive value, output will increase more than proportionately with an increase in all of the input. In other words, output per person can increase. Economic growth. These words reveal that any non-rival input to production has the potential to create the increasing returns to scale which allow for per capita economic growth, and that no rival input can. And we know that any physical input to production, bounded as it is in space and time, must be rival. So these essential non-rival inputs to production, whatever they are, must be non-physical and in that sense, somewhat invisible. Knowledge, ideas are the most obvious non-rival, non-physical, invisible inputs to economic growth. And we've spent the last 30 years thinking about them. And in some sense, 2 Nobel Prizes have just been awarded for thinking about that. But the fact that knowledge and ideas are the most obvious invisible inputs to economic growth doesn't mean that they're the only ones. If the field of economics considers these basic concepts in production theory anew, if it, as Romer has said elsewhere, spends somewhat less time working out solutions to systems of equations and a little bit more time defining precisely what the words we use mean, then I think the field of economics can address the possibility that invisible things, perhaps even invisible things in the human heart and human culture, may be very essential to economic growth. And that if we wish to continue to grow, we can't necessarily be neutral about such things. Third and finally, what can we do about all of this? Are there any practical conclusions for policymakers and leaders today? It is customary for social scientists, and especially for economists, and today you've invited an economist, to suggest practical solutions involving changing incentives. These days, I might be expected to arrive with a suggestion for a gentle nudge, perhaps along behavioral or psychological lines. But all of that wouldn't really make sense. After all, most of the value of new knowledge is, by assumption, external to the individual person who is creating it. And no economist has ever suggested a mechanism for fully internalizing this value, nor could such a mechanism ever be invented to cover all the lines along which every type of knowledge could possibly be created or diffused. If we do not value these relationships for their own sake, then we don't really value them at all. And the fruits that can only come from them will never be born. So having learned from economics, sociology, and neuroscience, to which discipline can we turn for insight about what is most worth valuing and for its own sake? If these changes come from something deep in the human heart, who might have wisdom about how to heal our hearts in this area? One wisdom tradition leader is our late Pope Francis, who wrote months before he died, "The heart makes all authentic bonding possible, since a relationship not shaped by the heart is incapable of overcoming the fragmentation caused by individualism. Two monads may approach one another, but they will never truly connect. A society dominated by narcissism and self-centeredness will increasingly become heartless. This will lead in turn to the loss of desire, since as other persons disappear from the horizon, we find ourselves trapped within walls of our own making, no longer capable of healthy relationships." But he also wrote, "Whenever a person thinks, questions, and reflects on his or her true identity, strives to understand the deeper questions of life and to seek God, or experiences the thrill of catching a glimpse of truth, it leads to the realization that our fulfillment as human beings is found in love. In loving, we sense that we come to know the purpose and goal of our existence in this world. This then is the solution I propose. For more of us to think, question, and reflect on our true identity, to experience, hopefully together, the thrill of catching a glimpse of truth, and to therefore realize that our fulfillment as human beings is found together or not at all. This also suggests the best lines for future research. The real test of the hypothesis I'm raising today is for us to build a more interrelated society and to see whether our creativity, collaboration, and sustainable growth indeed improve. I'm looking forward to the results of such a test. I hope it happens in my lifetime." Thank you.
Can I go back to the beginning when you
Yes.
showed these output growth and total factor productivity growth figures? And I wonder if we take on board the message that economists have tended to overestimate the importance of material items in output relative to the importance of immaterial items. Isn't that a possible explanation of what underpins this data?
Yes, I think that we have tended to focus on what we can measure. And it's just a lot easier to measure all of those things.
So we used to measure the number of tanks or motor cars or whatever that came off the end of the production line.
Yes.
And we simply cared about the fact that there were tanks and motor cars. And the products we have nowadays are not like that anymore. It's not the amount of stuff. It's almost the opposite, in fact.
Yes, it is, of course, the challenge of measuring productivity growth is that we know that our measurements are wrong, but what we need to understand is, are they getting more wrong over time? It is very likely that our estimates of productivity suffer from the exact problem you mentioned. And it's true that we're certainly producing a lot more, for instance, software today than we were before software was invented. But I would point to the research of those who specialize in estimating productivity to suggest that it could even go the other way. We attempt to measure the importance of software for the size of the economy. We might actually be getting the estimate wrong in the other direction. So it's a difficult question.
We can measure the amount of software, we can measure the volume of activity.
Yeah.
But we know very well that the volume of activity in a lot of these firms has nothing to do
Yes.
with the value of output.
Yes.
Whereas I think my business productivity has improved dramatically because of the internet. I or a research assistant used to have to spend an afternoon in a library to ascertain some simple reference
Yes.
that we thought we knew.
Yes.
Now I press a button and I get that.
Do you find that has affected your work hours?
No, it's affected the quality of my output.
Yes.
I think you can believe that assertions made in what I write now are either more likely true or more properly referenced than
Yes.
would have been a decade or two ago.
Yes, no, measuring the quality of our social science output is very, very difficult. I think those of us who've tried to measure the quality of our physical sciences output would suggest that quality experienced the kind of trends we outlined here. But that may be happening simultaneous to an improvement in social science.
Yeah. But also I think of my household productivity I used to have to get a taxi by going out in the street in the rain and waving a hand in the hope that one would stop, often vainly.
Yes.
And now I press a button on my phone
Yes.
and a cab arrives. That's a big improvement in my lifestyle, my personal productivity.
And
It's not measured.
not all such improvements are measured.
Yeah.
Directly or indirectly. That's true.
And I think very few.
Yeah.
Can I raise another question, which is you've talked very compellingly, I think, about the importance of people working together and non-rivalness, and the importance of distinguishing non-rivalness and rivalry in terms of inputs. We hear a great deal about intellectual property. Indeed,
Yes.
I discover at the moment every week I'm getting bombarded with stuff about how I need to protect my intellectual property from AI. And I may be unusual in thinking that the more people know about and read about what I've written, the more pleased I am. But that's certainly not what many people feel, and not what they seem to be encouraged to feel by the current climate.
Yes. I mean, I think that one difficulty we've experienced over the last several decades that's in part responsible for the decline in knowledge diffusion among for-profit firms has been increasing opportunities to litigate or to threaten litigation, more likely, regarding
Threatened
intellectual
litigation
property.
is a big
Yeah.
issue here, isn't it?
Yes. That threat of litigation is overhangs some of the lack of knowledge diffusion between firms, in the US especially. Yeah.
And what can we do about that? Should we relax much of our intellectual property protection?
I mean, most of the
Or even
innovations...
all of it?
Yeah, I mean, most of the innovation of our firms are not protected by patents. I mean, most of the innovations of our firms are, in some sense, broadly construed trade secrets. But, you know, the degree to which there's contractual restrictions in people interacting with each other after they leave a particular firm, it's probably too high in the United States, at least for the public interest.
So that's non-compete agreements rather than
agreements,
intellectual property, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Because the formal intellectual property is a pretty small portion, I think, of most of the innovations that make our companies productive.
But it's quite constraining. We were sort of talking about the threat of litigation here.
That threat of litigation is constraining, and it's gotten worse over time, I would say.
And it's true that Samsung's iPhone is much the same product as Apple's iPhone. Yes. Indeed, I discover that most of the parts in the iPhone are in fact made by Samsung.
Yes.
But they both successively imitated each other and been suing each other in the courts of the world.
Have. And at least for the first 10 years or so of the smartphone revolution, almost all of the profits were accrued to Apple, even with the kind of innovation you described from competitors.
Right. Let me open this to the audience for questions.
Yes.
Pretty much directly along the lines of what you've just mentioned there, Sir John, where you're talking about the example of flagging down a cab. My experience is that every time I use, let's call it Uber, for example, instead of a taxi, I might shave off £1 or £2, but the conversation will be dramatically different. I learn something about this city every time I get in a black cab. Every time I get in an Uber, I feel that I'm exploiting the guy. And so my question to you, Kirk, is you mentioned technology. I'm wondering, like, the way that you kind of referred to technology was as something which is kind of, if I understood correctly, a manifestation of a deeper decline in how we connect to each other. My feeling is that in my time as an Instagram user, which I haven't been for many years now, I became bitter and twisted towards my closest friends. And I was played off against them by a technology company which profited from that process. So I ask you can you elaborate a little bit more on how you think about technology? Because for young people, I think it's destroying our connections to each other.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. My experience with the black cabs in the city of Edinburgh during the 5 delightful days I've spent here exactly mirrors your own. I've learned about the history of philosophy, the history of economic thought, the history of poetry, the relationships between these three histories with each other, all with delightful banter and commentary the entire time. I should have paid triple for that experience. So it exactly mirrors your experience as well. I think, to elaborate on what you said and to elaborate on that point from my talk, I think that technology companies invent the technology that they believe we're going to be willing to pay for. Now, we may be willing to pay for it because of something deeply interesting and creative in the human heart that finds expression through that technology. Or we may be willing to pay for it because of our lizard brain and how that lizard brain can be exploited through various forms of, for example, social media. We get the technology that we wanted, whether we wanted it for good reasons or whether we wanted it for bad ones. I think that the changes in technology that could come in the future, if what we wanted was the delight of those unexpected in-person interactions with the people driving the black cabs, those changes are potentially unlimited. The future of technology is incredibly exciting, but we have to want the things that will create an environment that produces sustainable growth. If what we want are the things that create an environment that precludes sustainable growth, we'll get those things, and then we'll preclude sustainable growth. Thank you.
I had a fascinating discussion last night with my Uber driver
Yes.
about the differences between Scotland and Poland.
I'm glad that the Uber driver was also...
Whereas the black cab driver telling me things I already knew about Edinburgh.
There we go.
Or even worse, why Nigel Farage is the answer to the problems you've been describing. But perhaps we shouldn't generalize
Perhaps
too much
not.
from limited experiences.
Hi, great summary, and I really thank you for thinking deeply about the mechanism through which growth occurs. I just wondered, could you elaborate perhaps on kind of, should I think of this as an extension of the first welfare theorem that Adam Smith elaborated, right? So self-interest of the butcher and the baker is really very important for optimal outcome in some sense. And so is it in my self-interest to talk to others in order to optimize social welfare?
A great question. I mean, I think it can be in our self-interest to talk to others, but the kind of network creation which lays the foundation for deep creativity and economic growth, I'm convinced that that kind of network creation, because it's about instantiating something that has enormous externalities, by construction, that's what we're talking about, I don't think it's possible for it to be an extension of that theorem. I think it has to be, by construction, something that we just want for its own sake. My read of Adam Smith's descriptions of his discussions with his friends, he certainly gained a lot from those discussions, and they clearly were attempting to improve each other's work and complemented each other for improving each other's work. But they also just really liked hanging out together. They enjoyed it, and they kept it up for its own sake. And I think that matters, and that distinction between the first welfare theorem and what really is necessary for economic growth matters as well.
But aren't both these things important?
Yes.
And I think
yes,
of myself,
yeah.
I do have a lot of my best thoughts walking for myself, but they would be much worse if I didn't have an opportunity to exchange them with others, whether colleagues or students.
Yes, I agree. Both have to be important. It's a both and. It is a both and I think that the opportunity to exchange them with someone unexpected is often where the best ideas come. Certainly all of my collaborations started with unexpected conversations. Each one, especially, and the more productive the collaboration was, the more unexpected the initial meeting was.
Yeah, I've always valued the fact that as a product of High Table at Oxford, or was, that I have made articles in major historical journals and law journals, which are the product of these kind of conversations. Yes. And I fear, exactly in terms of your argument, that there's now much less opportunity
Yes.
to have them than there was when I was a young academic.
Yes, I mean, the university in that era was a university in the proper sense of the word. It attempted through traditions that we now no longer understand, such as high table, to create exactly the kind of substructure that you described. When we forget about that and turn it into just an opportunity to get people accredited or to sit in a large lecture hall, we're missing out on something essential.
James. Sorry.
Thanks. It was a great talk. I have a question about the relationship between sort of declining engagement in associational life that Putnam's work chronicles with the broader question of the degree to which the kind of the productive engines of our economy are also not collaborating, right? So people are bowling alone in Putnam's term. They're not engaged in associational life. But does that necessarily entail that scientists aren't spending time together, or that entrepreneurs are not hanging out in startup, hubs with people in finance? Just yesterday I was in the University of Edinburgh's archives looking at the minutes from the Poker Club, which is one of the many societies that included Adam Smith and David Hume and Hugh Blair and Adam Ferguson and all these people. Now, were the average day laborers in Edinburgh more civically engaged, and so these societies sprung up because of that, or was it that these more elite members of society just did something special? So I'm just curious about that, because you use kind of the Putnam data to show kind of declining or increasing social isolation, but does that necessarily mean that the scientists aren't hanging out?
No, that's a great question. So first, I want to even emphasize what you said. Silicon Valley, a bunch of other examples show that where the scientists or the innovators, other entrepreneurs are hanging out is exceptionally productive. And you can see that the price of hanging out in those societies has gone out through the roof. But the reason the price has gone through the roof to spend time in the Silicon Valleys of the world is because now we have a situation in which there's a barrier to entry into those groups. I agree that the elites are still spending time with each other, but it's increasingly difficult for the potentially creative people on the margin of those elites to get in. And the sclerosis that occurs is measurable not only in the prices of real estate and the few locations where you can still physically bump into another entrepreneur, it's also reflected in the fact that people's aspirations in a place like Silicon Valley or just outside of it are now to create a firm that will get purchased by Facebook, or Meta as it's now called, rather than to create something truly new of their own that they then continue for 30 years and take under their own wings. So if you broaden that then and you look at the overall degree of interaction among scientists, a lot of the interaction among scientists who aren't lucky enough to be part of a small elite that still meets together, a lot of that interaction is digital. And the interesting thing about digital interaction is that it has to be very intentional and very specific. You decide, and someone else hopefully decides simultaneously, that you want to have a conversation between these two people about this topic. That's why you emailed each other. Now, the topic may spread, but a third person's not going to randomly enter the Zoom call after it starts. What happens you're lucky enough to be in an in-person environment, and people fight very hard to be part of the in-person environments where people are still hanging out in academia and in entrepreneurship. If you're in a physical environment, the best way of replicating that digitally, and the easiest way to see that we're not doing this digitally, would be to have a screen in front of you that goes everywhere as you walk. And at random intervals, somebody you've never met before appears in the screen and starts talking to you. We haven't invented that technology, and we never will. But that would be the technology that would allow the digital world to give us back what we've lost from the physical one.
Kirk, fantastic. There's a lot to learn there, understand, and act upon. Let me focus, like quite a few other comments, on the non-rivalrous nature of the certain inputs to production, right? And your suggestion that economics might have less to say about it. So we talked about universities. Universities were created for a purpose that was to spread universal education. It was to create a space where people could discuss with each other. This was created. This was an institution which was created. The workplace was similarly created, right, out of the need for people to get together and do certain things together, right? So with that in mind, now, and of course, new institutional economics has internalized this, economics of the household, for example, talks about joint, production within the household and how that is maximized. So let me try and challenge your notion that economics might have less to say about creating institutions where people can go and interact, with, communicate, and work together, particularly when we are under the threat also in the workplace, and workplace as an institution of working from home, where many people would not potentially like to come and meet others. And so, I want to put that to you. Thank you.
Oh, no, great question, and thank you for pressing on that. So I think that economics over the last 30 years, especially the empirical branch of economics that has been attempting to understand patterns whose explanation has long eluded us, has frequently touched upon the borderlands of economics with sociology, with anthropology, with other disciplines. I think at a conceptual level, what economics specializes in as a science of scarcity is really trying to determine which patterns can be explained by the application of incentives to a given set of preferences. And I think that's where this question that we've addressed today potentially butts against the border of economics as a field. Because I think we are seeing a change of something in the human heart and in human culture in terms of what we value. And if just fundamentally we now increasingly value being alone and increasingly just fail to apprehend the good of a particular type of being together, then if that's true, it's not clear to me what economics qua economics could say about it. I think empirical economics that studies many of the questions that you've mentioned touches upon the patterns that emerge from this. But theoretical economics and the foundational concepts, the conceptual foundation of economics, it really does treat preferences as a given and tries to teach us how we can optimize and create institutions given those preferences. I think we need to draw upon potentially an interaction with other disciplines which are willing to dive into those preferences and not leave them as a given.
Because do you have an explanation, either economic or sociological, of why people are more inclined to prefer being alone?
Yeah, I don't want to put myself out there with a specific explanation now, because I think the work still needs to be done. I think, for instance, the foundation of what makes friendships possible is often participation in the kind of organizations that Putnam studies. In his more recent book, he discusses institutional factors that may be involved in this. But I think if you read his arguments about these things that form the substructure of friendship, I think he himself would point in the direction of this being something to do with culture and potentially changeable by those who can teach culture in ways that, as he himself has said, sometimes make his fellow sociologists uncomfortable. So that means even he is touching upon the boundary line of his academic discipline here. I do think that where the collaboration has to occur is actually going back to Adam Smith, theory of moral sentiments. I think we need a theory of the kind of moral sentiments that are behind this. But that requires talking to the philosophers who've worked in the last 249 years since the Wealth of Nations. So talking to philosophers and speaking as a professor at the University of Notre Dame, talking to theologians as well, I mean, of which, Pope Francis's contributions to theology are very relevant here. I think that's where the conversation needs to head next.
It was fascinating, thank you. And in no way do I want to downplay the importance of everything from the bowling alone hypothesis to Pope Francis and the human instincts in this. But I wonder whether it's also possible that a lot of this is to do with patterns that we've encouraged in our economic governance of the last 30 years. I had what to me was a fascinating and depressing experience. I'm involved with a large American university, and they were talking to me about how difficult it was to be able, particularly in the healthcare world, to be able to persuade their professors that they should be turning their innovations into companies. Now, previously, I said, why are they against this? And they said, well, they were brought up to believe that the most important was knowledge for the world and spreading their ideas. Now, I think that's a lot more to do with our desire to see company formation, to see rivalrous goods, if you like. So I wonder whether it's not in competition with what you're saying, but I wonder whether there's also a route of research into how, in a sense, the push we've had in economics and society over the last 30 or 40 years has taken us deliberately away from those types of accidental public spirited knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question and a great point. Of course, our own individual experiences vary so much in that regard. I feel that in my generation, born in 1980, what we were raised, at least on our side of the pond, was to be very, very excited about capitalism, for a lack of a better term, making greed great again, I think was whatever the phrase was. So measuring those trends is difficult, of course. But I do think that the financial rewards for absolute top entrepreneurship after taxes have increased over the last several decades. So if it was about financial incentives for that kind of thinking, the financial incentives have promoted that kind of thinking more than they did 30 years ago. But it doesn't mean that your hypothesis is incorrect. I think it would just point again to a non-financial incentive in that particular change in culture, perhaps educational.
It's strange
Yeah.
because I had a conversation in Oxford on Monday, which was exactly the opposite of the one you described, in which people were saying, and this fits my experience, that 50 years ago people would have been disparaging of the idea that they might turn their ideas into business. Now they're waiting for opportunities to do so.
Yeah.
Right, I'm puzzled by the fact that I have no live stream questions. Are there any that I should? In that case, I think we should call a halt to this and thank Kirk very much indeed for the extremely stimulating address he's given us.
Thank you.
And I think we are learning from these events about Panmure House Prize and the like. We're gradually developing an understanding of the processes of innovation and growth and the way in which they depend on interactions between people in a way that so much of economics has neglected in the past.
Thank you.
And I think I have, yes. I have to give to you
Thank you.
a
Thank you.
tribute to...
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kirk.
Thank you, Sir John. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.